Hello, I'm Will Yeoman. I'm CEO at Writing the WA and I'm joined today by poet Lisa Collyer. Now, Lisa is a poet and educator living and working in Perth. She writes poetry about women's bodies like the jagged edge of a can opened up. Wow. She has been published in Westerly, Cordite, Rabbit, Australian Poetry Anthology and more. She was an Inspire Writers in Residence with the National Trust of WA and was shortlisted for the Dorothy Hewett Award for her unpublished manuscript. Her debut collection, How to Order Eggs Sunny Side Up, is published with Life Before Man, the poetry imprint of Gazebo Books. And it's this collection which brings us together in the State Library of Western Australia. Lisa, welcome to Pod Street.
Oh, thank you so much, Will. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, let's just expand a little bit more on that biography. I'm always fascinated what brings people to poetry in the first place.
Yeah, okay. I didn't start writing this book as poetry. I actually explored fiction, memoir, until I was in a life writing workshop and somebody said to me, "That's really lyrical, it sounds like poetry." And it was the magic moment. And I was like, yes, that's the fit. And from then on, I just ran with it and it was the right fit. Yeah,
Okay.
I needed the right genre to write this story, so to speak.
So in that regard, I mean, obviously there is a lot of literature, and I'm talking about prose now, that certainly has a very poetic quality in terms of style. So what for you is special about poetry in particular? Is it the concision? Is it the freedom linguistically? I mean, what is it?
It's a few things. I think I definitely like short and sweet. I'm into succinct. I kind of feel like, say it in so many words and get to the point. But I also didn't want to tell it straight. And I agree, many prose writers write beautiful sort of lyrical verse within prose, but I wasn't interested in just telling this happened, that happened, particularly for the more poetry come memoir poems. I wanted to tell it slant. I wanted to get inside the feeling. I wanted to make connections. So, yeah, that kind of, there's more scope for mystery, I think, and nuance and complexity in poetry for me.
Well, you're absolutely right, but I guess it's those very qualities that also frighten people off poetry. It's a double-edged sword.
Well, I hope they're frightened. If they're not, I'm not doing my job properly. Just joking.
No, of course. And that famous phrase you mentioned is, of course, from Emily Dickinson. Was she much of a sort of presence in your poetic life, or not really?
Yes and no. People say who influences you. I read widely, but I read more Australian contemporary poets.
Sure.
I read all of them. And then every now and then I dip into the classics, depending what I'm researching at the time. So, no, I wouldn't say she specifically, but yes, I've definitely read her work. I think on a more subconscious level rather than a conscious level.
Yes, and as I say, talking about contemporary poets and contemporary Western Australian poets.
Absolutely.
John Kinsella, you're riffing off there.
Yes.
Kevin Gillam as well. So there's certainly a very strong presence to the point where you're in conversation with them right here in this book.
Yeah, well, I kind of see all writing as a conversation with other texts. And, part of it is foregrounding perhaps silent voices, bodies that aren't seen, perspectives that aren't viewed, or just, having a conversation with those texts.
Okay. Look, why don't we hear a poem at this point, because I know you've got a few up your sleeve. So let's start with the first one, just to give people a sense of your style and your subject matter and so forth, and then we can continue our conversation.
Yes, lovely. And is there a particular one you'd like me to read?
Oh, look, I know you've got some marked there. Let's start with the first one that takes your fancy.
Okay. All right, so this poem's Bildungsroman. There are 283 steps between childhood and home, a right to an uncertain future. I try to delay the advent, idle heel to toe, leave no gaps. My left heel strikes the ground between my best friend's house and a knife hurdled. The footpath absorbs a scream. My left arch rears, the keystone bears the load. A schoolgirl's scoliosis forms a question mark and asks, why me? But a time-lapse gate still journeys to a destination. I fail to disembark heart from mouth, dissociate at Trader's Gate, tripped by guilt, each foot rolled like my adolescence.
I mean, I really love that poem, and I think it's even the title Bildungsroman, because we normally associate that with much larger works. You know, we think about people like Goethe writing those classic Bildungsroman. This is very concise. It's also something that I'm guessing is autobiographical as well. Let's focus on that poem specifically for a while. Tell me more about its where it came from.
Okay. Well, you're right. It is autobiographical. So it is referencing adolescent trauma at a particular stage in my life, at age 14, when home suddenly became an unsafe place. And so that aspect was about walking home from school and not wanting to get home. And so I literally would put foot to foot with no gaps to try and take the longest possible time to get home. So that's sort of the initial spark. And then I was exploring and researching about the way feet roll. So I'm very much interested in sort of the mechanics of the body. And so that's where I was sort of referring to the arch and rolling. And why I called it Bildungsroman, as a former English teacher, I tutor now, I'm no longer in schools. I taught a lot of coming-of-age novels, and I kind of wanted to disrupt that genre and tell a slightly different coming-of-age. So that's kind of where that came from. Yeah.
It's interesting because when you talk about wanting to take a long time, I also read that as not wanting to grow old too quickly.
Well, absolutely. It's kind of like, being home was growing up too fast because it suddenly was fraught and the childhood was over there. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so as with many poetic collections, these poems might have appeared elsewhere and printed at various points along. How does one go about curating a collection like this and giving it some kind of cohesion?
It's interesting because at first I started writing individual poems, and then when I was in the Westerly Writers Development Program and worked with Lucy Dugan as my mentor, she said that she's starting to see themes in my work, and that's made me start to think very differently the way I wrote. And from that point on, and then with the writers' residencies that I did, I started writing in sequences and actually articulated in my own mind what I was trying to do. So that was sort of having poems talk to each other. And then the actual collation was, I tried on Excel. Didn't work. I needed to print them out, put them out on my lounge room floor, and I started to look at themes where there was repetition. So the body, architecture, social, cultural, escape, all of those. And I kind of put them together that way, collated them. But it was also about the individual poems, like page to page. So I wanted to sort of change the mood. One might be really irreverent and then the other very vulnerable and tender. And so I sort of worked like that. And I think everyone has a different process, but that's what I did with this one.
No, absolutely. And having read it through from cover to cover, you do get the sense of your being aware of the effects of that movement through the book. But I'm guessing you obviously have to cater for people who are just going to dip in and out and just read the odd poem here and there.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, it's interesting. And people read poetry different. Like I'm having people tell me, which is really nice, they're either reading it from way to nay, or they're dipping in and just reading one or two and savouring them and going. But I guess that's what I like about poetry, that you can do that. Unlike a novel, it wouldn't quite make sense to just dip into page 13. So yeah, each poem is its own whole as well as a part of a whole.
No, I think that's really lovely.
Yeah.
Talking about Lucy Dugan, you mentioned her explicitly in one of the poems too, which I quite like, as well as KSP in terms of the residencies you've done.
Yes.
How important has it been for the support of both those kinds of, she's a poet as well, of course, but editors, and also the support of writers' centres like KSP in pulling a work like this together?
Absolutely fundamental. I think, firstly, having a mentor and getting into things like the Westerly Writers Development Program or residencies builds your confidence and endorses your work, because we've all got imposter syndrome and it's really difficult when you're starting out. Also, being connected to community is vital. Getting feedback on your work and just nurturing your voice. Lucy particularly, she's a light editor. She never tried to put her voice on mine and make me be like her. I could never anyway. But rather saw what qualities I had and nurtured that. And that really gave me a lot of confidence. And the residencies were fantastic because, one, the connection to other writers, but also to their archives or different ways of looking at things. And that really helped my writing grow beyond my own autobiographical poems, which, was probably the impetus to write the book initially, but it's actually only a small part of the book. And I'm glad, because I didn't want to just tell my story either. I wanted to tell a bigger picture about women's bodies.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was another feature of this collection, this exploration of women's bodies. But just touching on that other point as well, that idea of a community, that is also something I'm certainly aware of if I'm reading a collection of poetry, that it's part of a broader universal sort of community of poets, both, living and dead. And so that awareness is very important too, and that clearly comes through in your style. Yeah. But let's go back to women's bodies, because that's obviously something that's very important. And you're quite, I guess, in your face sometimes, shall we say? Is that fair enough?
Absolutely.
When exploring,
I don't hold back.
No. Why is that such an important theme for you?
Well, in polite society, there are certain topics we don't talk about, which is fair enough. Like if we were just walking around every day, not just talking about the weather and how are you and just sort of bleeding all over the place, it'd get quite messy and uncomfortable. So why do that in a poetry collection? So this poetry collection is about talking about the things we don't talk about but exist. And there is a societal gag order on certain subjects, even amongst progressive circles. And so I wanted to talk to those, and because they are real, they happen, people experience them, and I think they need some airspace to legitimise people's experience of them.
Look, you're absolutely right. I suppose art in general has been the place where one has to go to find these kinds of articulations. And when you say not polite society, but if you say society more broadly,
everyday conversations.
There are conversations you can have that do venture into this territory, which is quite fascinating. I'm sure will inspire you to write a poem or two. So the body, but also the body's, what's the word? Susceptibility to illness, to age, all those kinds of things concern you as well. And I just want to read one of my favourite sort of sections. And this is just from a poem which was inspired by another piece of non-fiction writing. So let's we go back here. I smell death, it clings and I hold on, devoted to your tragic fate, the muse that leaps when arrows turn to lead, another bastard I cannot bear. I mean, that's really interesting.
Okay.
And in fact, that's not the quote I meant to read, but because I scrolled down my phone with all my quotes on it. But I love that one too, which is why I took note of it. But let me just read the other one, which picks up sort of half sentence.
Okay.
And it goes, to your country in fistfuls of dirt, inter my liquid mess of bruised decay into a soft tissue slush. Let flesh-eaters bunk in my colonies, bacterial guests feed. A spleen, a heart, a death march to a microbial clock, lock joints and throw away sovereignty.
Yay.
Pretty strong stuff, hey?
Well,
let's take those two. Those two work quite well together, those two quotes, actually.
That's interesting. Well, I can tell you where that poem came from. I wrote that poem during the height of, the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when we were seeing those horrible pictures on television about mass burials in Brazil and all these very sci-fi images in Italy and, you know.
The air of unreality.
Yeah.
And sort of, oh, my God, this is really happening.
I literally was thinking about death because we all were. It was like our mortality was suddenly at the fore. And I've done yoga in the past, and one of the meditations is to meditate on your own death and actually lie there and imagine yourself decaying.
Well, hence the corpse pose as well.
Absolutely, and the corpse pose, that's right. And that's actually meant to be a comfort, which seems ironic, particularly in, I think, Western culture. We're afraid to talk about death.
Well, we're not so confronted with it on a daily basis.
I think that might be a good point. Yeah,
or
absolutely.
Indeed, everyone has been in the past.
Yes, that's right. And it's abject. So a lot of the poems are talking about what's abject. And obviously the idea of our body decaying is abject. It's something we don't want to come to soon. So I actually researched what happens to a body when it's decaying, which is hence why I've got that reference at the bottom. And then I took the next step of thinking about my body decaying on Aboriginal country.
Wow,
and that's, yes. So it was also as a white settler, my body decaying. So it's got that sort of double kind of meaning. So it's about, I kind of feel like the only way, and it sounds a bit morbid, I know, but the only way I can kind of make up for invasion is perhaps to disappear.
It's a cheery conversation.
I know. It's that's the way I think, Will. So it's a bit extreme, I know.
Thinking about the First Nations aspect and this idea of when a person who's related is with them, like a part of them inhabits their bodies as well, the family's body. So when they die, you have to have a sort of like a smoking ceremony to basically, you know, take out that aspect of the spirit from that other person and bid them farewell. Do you feel something like that when you are leaving behind works like poetry? And this is part of you.
Yeah, that's funny because when I did my box opening video for publication day and it was spontaneous, I actually made the comment, I finally got something to leave behind, which is kind of interesting because being a childless woman, and notice the negative there, which is something that comes up, I think there is this sense that perhaps it's just something we want to do. We feel we need to leave something behind. So I don't know. I didn't think of that when I was writing it.
But it is a kind of immortality. I mean,
I guess
artists immemorial have thought about this, you know, and Shakespeare's written many sonnets on this. This is, I leave this behind, you know, this will outlive me, will outlive you. Yeah. This is my monument to you, those kinds of things. Do you feel like that's still a valid way to think about art?
Not really. No, it'll probably end up in the bargain bin at some point, but who knows? No, and I think there's quite a lot of poems I have that say leave no trace. I really just think of us as nature.
That's more of a Buddhist thing, isn't it? Really?
Well, I don't know. I'm not Buddhist.
No, I'm not suggesting.
Yeah, but it's that idea that I'm just going to go back to the earth like everything else, and then something will grow from that. So it's cyclical. So I guess I'm thinking in sort of more
Christina
seasonal.
Rossetti poem which says, "I'm not dead. I'm in the winds and the flowers and the trees."
That's it. Yeah, it's circular. Very much.
Beautiful.
I mean, I am a gardener, so I do definitely think of that.
I wonder why there were so many references to plants.
There is. Yeah.
I want to read you a quote that's not from your collection.
Okay.
And I want you to tell me what you think of it.
Okay.
So this is from the surrealist poet Joyce Mansour.
Oh, yes.
And she says, I went to a cemetery for a Muslim funeral. Suddenly a woman started to scream. The scream began at very first, deep in the belly, and became more and more shrill, deafening. It seemed to come from the top of the skull, you know, the fontanelle from which religions often say that the soul escapes at the moment of death. It's terrifying. That is poetry. I write between two doors, all of a sudden, like the woman who started to scream.
Yeah, and I love Joyce Mansour. So it's interesting. I've actually looked at her work, and it inspired a poem because she was a surrealist poet, as you said, another poem in my second collection that I'm writing. So I looked a little bit at that. Yeah, it's fabulous. It's visceral. It's about, I don't know, perhaps it's a working class person in me. It's about sort of letting everything hang out. That's what I'm interested in. Like, I really love writers like Elena Ferrante who go to the grit and the obscene and the undignified. Yeah.
So, I mean, this raises an interesting question. When you're editing, or when you're your own work, self-editing, or whether you're refining your poems, does it make sense to leave a bit of a burr, to leave a bit of roughness, because that speaks to the working class, to the roughness, to the visceral nature of the work?
I think it speaks to humanity. And I don't think imperfection. Yes. We are imperfect. We are messy. Even the most beautiful things like love and romance is messy. You know, if you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, for example, sex is messy and dirty and at times abject, even though it might be wonderful.
I think we have the tendency, don't we, to have these idealised images of all our interactions with other people.
Absolutely.
And they're effectively caricatures because they don't address the complexity of the situation, do they?
It's the gloss. And like I said earlier, you know, we do that because we can't be all hanging out all the time because it just gets all too messy and we wouldn't be able to function. And no one would want to hang out with you. So you just save it for your poetry.
Absolutely. And then they get to choose to read it.
That's right. So, no, and I guess it's just, I don't know, I'm just interested in humanity and a truth. I don't want to claim truth. There's no truth, in my opinion. There's different truths. And that's one aspect of it, is that we're messy and we're dirty. And also I want it to be in your face. And hopefully I've done it in a slightly polished way. You know, it's not completely rough. Like, it is a construct. Let's face it, this isn't raw. I won't claim that it's not a construct, because it is. All art is. But at the same time, I just want to bring attention to those things that we sometimes forget exist, you know, like where meat comes from or
well, that poem is another one of my favourites. I mean, I should say I'm a vegetarian, so but that process of slaughtering an animal, I took part in that with my father when I was young, growing up, you know, in rural York. We would slaughter our own sheep, and that was the right thing to do.
Yes.
You know, that removal of the viscera, and it was a part of our job to bury that viscera, actually. It really makes you understand, doesn't it?
Well, I actually did slaughter a sheep myself, and I didn't grow up on a farm, but I was dating a farmer, and I have also been a vegetarian occasionally. Yes. And I was like, if I'm going to eat meat, I should be prepared to slaughter that particular animal. And so I did. And so it was kind of interesting. So that was a little bit.
How did it change you?
Well, I still eat meat.
No, I'm not suggesting it made you a vegetarian, but it must have changed you at some level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially for a suburban girl to actually do that, it wasn't as hard as I thought it was. I mean, it was totally abject and kind of disgusting, but it was actually quite beautiful in a sense. And I know that might sound obscene, but I apologised to the sheep as well. And we did eat all the sheep, and it was really a great awareness of where it came from, you know, every aspect of it. So I kind of think it's important rather than, and I guess that's similar about the poems, about this is where it all comes from, rather than the nice packaged, I don't know, fillet steaks in Coles supermarket or something that doesn't look like meat.
Is this a collection of fillet steaks?
I think it might be. Bloody and,
Or is it just these sort of, you know, raw sort of lumps of flesh thrown on the table in front of us and saying, right, eat this?
I think I'm just perverse. What can I say?
I think it's time for another poem.
Okay, it might be.
What else have you got for us?
All
Something that contrasts with Buildings Renown.
All right. Well, do you want me to do Meditate on Death, or do you feel like we've done that and go to Suffragette Bluebells?
Go to Suffragette.
Yeah, because that's a bit different. Yes. Give us a break from the fillet steaks. All right, Suffragette Bluebells. He was determined we would carry equal amounts. We packed to sustain a night in the Bibbulmun track. My backpack was a cheap Big W sack. no support and sagging way behind. So as I walked, I held it aloft to give my aching lumbar some respite. We carried our own water in, an extra litre, just in case. The dusty ground moved beneath me, startling as the water jostled to my gate. A walking waterbed in tow. I joined him in the wonder that was mainly on the ground, as little trips sprang forth. Jutting rocks and roots defied the tramping of the snake-signed fork. The sun was high and unrepentantly drained me, as the backpack, despite the regular gulping, seemed to get leaden upon my back. He whistled while he walked ahead and often out of sight. I stumbled here and there and focused less. The kilometres accrued, but destination never seemed to find me. My hands now moved beneath the sack and fist held tight, pressed close against my back to ease the thudding pain. He whistled and was out of sight, but I kept my pride in check, not wanting him to think I couldn't handle it. At last I bowed down to respite and sat, then lay upon my back sack still on and laying in that trampled dirt. I didn't care that he was gone. I would rest and wait. I felt a calm surrender that I hadn't felt throughout the year. That was the school year marathon that every year swamps and punishes. A conveyor belt of clouds moved by, and I plunged right into childhood. No daisy chains, but there were ground, suffragette bluebells. I limply called his name, but knew he wouldn't hear, for he was marching way ahead in whistling rapture. I held him back this time of year, but he bravely kept me going, each term 3, as I sunk stubbornly determined to surrender. But someone always stopped me. And there it was. It landed, without sound or fanfare, a robin. It was red, and rotated to and fro, so close I felt it knew, but was not afraid of me.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I really love that poem, and I love the sort of vivid nature of it, but the apparition of the bird and the colours, the way you juxtapose the colours is extraordinary. It's also an example of, I guess, a prose poem as well.
Absolutely. And, it's kind of interesting. I think on that level, that was partly autobiographical.
Yes.
And the robin did appear. But it's also, I think, I'm exploring a few different things. One is I do find nature is where I gain perspective when things get a little bit overwhelming. I find grounding in nature definitely a way to just take a breath, get perspective and recalibrate. But it's also a comment on, I think, feminism and how it's in some way it's kind of been a con. You know, we are being able to work and we're so overwhelmed doing so much. And as a full-time teacher, it was unsustainable. My workload was so ridiculous and the bureaucracy that I had to deal with on a day-to-day basis, let alone the dealing with teaching high school students and ATAR English was just it was very punishing, and in the end I had to leave, like many teachers are leaving. So it's kind of a comment on that, and I guess trying to keep up with the patriarchy who are one step ahead, i.e. my husband in this case. He kind of feels bad that he's been written in that poem. He's much nicer.
Well, to say, it's semi-autobiographical.
It's semi.
Yes,
they're only ever semi, yeah.
Of course.
They're just a spark.
Absolutely. Now, I did mean to say that, you're a beautiful reader as well, and I wonder how important performance is in your poetry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a performance poet.
No, I
like
understand.
Some people are very fabulous in the way they express, although I do believe reading is really important, and I can feel when I've got the crowd, and I do use my voice to kind of take them on that journey and hold them, so the pauses, the pacing. And I think partly that's being a teacher, having to keep a class of 30 teenagers is challenging. And so I think maybe I've got that experience, and I enjoy reading, and I want them to sort of Well, I guess backtracking. It's also the way I write the poem. So when I write a poem, the way I know the lineation, for example, and the rhythm is I listen back to it on my phone over and over and over. And that tells me when to change or when to change lines, etc. It's about the delivery.
Look, I think you're right.
containing.
Yes, it's and it goes back to that the primacy of storytelling as well.
Absolutely,
doesn't it? You know, keeping an audience on the edge of their seats.
Exactly.
And then this, and then this, and then this.
Yeah.
It's quite lovely.
That's it.
And it's also like music. I mean, I always insist that for me, the poem on the page is like a musical score.
Yeah.
It doesn't really come alive until you perform it, even if it's only in your imagination.
Absolutely, and that's also like I'm writing free verse, but there is a lot of rhyme, for example, in there, but it's internal or it's slant.
Exactly,
And,
there is a music there, but it's not like completely, unlike other aspects of the collection, it's not in your face.
No, it's not. And I just feel that, like I write by ear in that sense. I'm not writing in strict metre, but I write by ear and it is very rhythmical. And, I don't know, it just comes naturally to me.
Well, Lisa, unfortunately our time together has come to an end in this beautiful space here at the State Library of WA. Where can people buy your book?
They can buy it everywhere. All bookstores. It's being stocked in Australia and New Zealand.
Fantastic.
So if you're going local, Crow, Rabble, Planet, Boffins.
All the good indies,
All the good.
Fantastic.
And over East as well.
Yes.
Readings, etc., Glee books. All of them.
Online?
Dymix, everywhere. QBD, you name it.
And if we wanted to know more about you, you've got a website?
I do.
Yeah.
You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Lisa Collyer, that's with a Y, not an I, poet. And that has links to various things. And when you've read it, I'd love it if you went onto Goodreads and gave me a review, whether you like it or not.
5 stars,
Yeah,
please.
5 or 3.
Or a half.
Or whatever. Just tell me what you think.
And don't forget, if you're reading it, you chose to read it and you have no right to be offended by any of the contents.
Well, thanks, Will.
That's all right. I thought I'd leave you on a high.
Yes.
No. In all seriousness, it's an absolutely beautiful collection. It is both challenging and life-affirming in equal measure. So, Lisa, again, thank you for joining us on Pod Street.
Thank you very much, Will, for having me.